very much indeed, Mr. Chope. And I would also like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member from Montgomeryshire, for securing this debate. And he has a strong record of fighting for justice on this issue, and particularly in the case of the Baha'i, where he chairs the all-party group and focused many of his remarks, although obviously we've had a very good and wide-ranging debate on various aspects of human rights in Iran. And it's particularly helpful, I think, when all too often in discussing Iran our thoughts turn to the very important issue of nuclear proliferation, that we do also find time to turn to the issue of human rights. And I was very moved and struck by the contribution from the Honourable Member for Ribble Valley, because I think even in the language of human rights, it's sometimes easy to forget that what we're talking about is not just philosophical concepts, but we're talking about, the experiences, the horrific and unthinkable experiences of individual people in countries, in Iran, in other countries around the world very often, who just don't even get the basic rights, which, getting up in the morning, going around our daily business, we all too often just take for granted. So I think that is very important to reflect on. It's obviously a very timely debate given the protests over the Iranian election and indeed the harsh repression of those protests. And it's difficult to know the exact figures, but the reports suggest dozens of people have been killed, and it could well be possibly hundreds of protesters still in prison with their families not necessarily knowing about their fate. There's not even good access to lawyers for those who have been held. And in fact, two honourable members, and my honourable friend for Ceredigion and the honourable member for Ribble Valley, mentioned the case of Nida Sultan, who I think anybody who has seen that image, it will be forever seared on their minds and consciousness as a symbol of the repression of those protests, and indeed be deeply concerning that somebody has suffered that fate. I think it is important because there's a danger that when we in this Parliament discuss human rights in Iran or in any other country in the world, it can be seen as meddling. But this is absolutely not meddling in Iran's internal affairs. As my honourable friend from Montgomeryshire pointed out, Iran itself has signed the Universal Convention on Human Rights and the UN Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and it therefore has international obligations to uphold these. Now, I certainly will call on the UK government to uphold human rights when, in my view, it sometimes fails to do so. And I would say there are examples of the promotion of detention without charge, or some of the murky allegations we've had recently over torture and possible complicity in torture. And I think we must be as rigorous about calling on our own government to uphold these international standards as we are on other governments. And in fact, by taking that equal and fair approach, it is therefore possible for us to look at other governments around the world and also call on them to uphold their international obligations, which is what we are hoping to do. And I would wholeheartedly endorse the point made by the Honourable Member for Islington North that in asking other countries to accept international election observers, we should certainly be open enough to have international election observers here. And in fact, when we had quite the difficulties in 2007 with the Scottish elections and the ballot papers, it perhaps would have been helpful for us to have had that. Certainly.
I know for certain that the Council of Europe would be delighted if they got an invitation from the British government in order to observe the next general election in this country.
Well, we can only hope that is greeted positively by the government. But of course, we do need to remember as well, Mr. Chope, that Britain does have a limited influence in Iran, especially as the relations have deteriorated since the election, with the very worrying expulsion of British diplomats from Tehran and arrest of the Iranian British officials. So I think that we need to have a degree of realism about what our government can achieve. Nonetheless, we still do have bilateral relations, and we have relations through the EU and the UN, and we should certainly be using whatever influence we have to uphold human rights. There is only a short time available for a wind-up, so I will touch briefly on a number of different areas. Freedom of expression, I think, is one of the most concerning aspects of denial of human rights, because, as has been pointed out, when you don't have freedom of expression, then that actually gets in the way of people upholding all other sorts of rights, because then the democratic system falls apart. I have to declare a bit of an interest perhaps in a debate on human rights as a member of Amnesty International, and they are fairly damning on Iran's record on freedom of expression in their 2009 report, The State of the World's Human Rights. And they say the authorities maintained tight restrictions on freedom of expression, association and assembly. They cracked down on civil society activists, including women's rights and other human rights defenders and minority rights advocates. Activists were arrested, detained and prosecuted, often in unfair trials, banned from travelling abroad and had their meetings disrupted. And I think that this has really come to fruition, and we've seen it on the television screens recently. I do hope that one day the Iranian media will be freer to report the views and news which are perhaps different to the state media. I think there's also, following the elections, an interesting development in terms of the use of social media, which has been taken up in huge numbers by Iranians, whether that's blogging or Facebook or Twitter. And what this is actually doing is handing power to ordinary people so they can report what's happening, and effectively giving all citizens the power to be journalists. There have also been reported crackdowns on this social media, so it is still a concern, but it is much more difficult to crack down on everybody and on the internet, as I think even the Chinese are finding. So I actually think that the internet will increasingly be a powerful tool for freedom, particularly in those countries where there is repression, because you can employ thousands and thousands of people to crack down on it, but I think ultimately that will be an unsuccessful task. I'll certainly give way.
I agree with what she's saying. Would she also put some strictures on Google and some of the other operators that go along with regime interference and indeed connive at censorship and repression of free speech?
I think the Honourable Gentleman makes an excellent point. I think, if I'm right in remembering, Google's motto is "Don't be evil," and I think there's certainly some questioning over whether or not collaborating in oppression of people's freedom of expression would be living up to that motto that they have. Turning to the issue of freedom of religion, I won't go over all of the arguments, but I think it's fair to say that my honourable friend expertly described the situation with the Baha'i community, which is Iran's largest non-Muslim religious group. I have a small Baha'i community in Beresden in my constituency, and I know they share the concerns very much for the detained leaders, and particularly with the timing of the expected trial. I've personally written to the Foreign Secretary and the Iranian ambassador to ask for pressure on this issue in terms of a fair trial and indeed release of these individuals. I've yet to receive a response, but I really just have to say our thoughts are with them. We have to hope that true justice will prevail, but I'm unfortunately not overly optimistic about what the outcome might well be. It's not just the Baha'is who are discriminated against in Iran. Christians, Jews and Zoroastrians are minorities recognised in the constitution and apparently protected by law, but they still experience discrimination. The case of the two Christian women was mentioned to have been held in prison, and indeed Iranian Jews experience official discrimination. Of course, Ahmadinejad is well known for his anti-Semitic views and Holocaust denial, and so I think there's worries with religion as well. Turning to the issue of women, Iran is one of only 7 countries in the world not to have signed up or ratified CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And it's up there with Sudan, Somalia, Qatar, and the Polynesian islands of Tonga, Palau, and Nauru. The family law imposes a lot of restrictions on women. Marital rape is not a crime. Honour killings regularly occur. And the women's rights groups who have tried to fight for equality have experienced a huge amount of cracking down and imprisonment. And I think this is something which is of huge concern. Perhaps I say that as the only woman speaking in this debate, although I'm sure other members will share that worry about the position of women in Iranian society. And indeed then, turning to the question of homosexuals who regularly experience dreadful discrimination and indeed execution. In Iran, more than 4,000 people have been executed for homosexuality since 1979 in Iran. Worryingly, the UK government still deports gay Iranians despite the possible risk of imprisonment and execution in their home country. And while I don't have time to go into these remarks in more detail, I would welcome the Minister's comments on that. And the only other point I wanted to raise, which has already come up briefly, was the execution of minors, which I think is absolutely horrendous. I think I'm against the death penalty in all its various forms in any case, but explicitly against international law. Even the Americans have stopped doing this since 2005, and clearly it's something which is just unacceptable, and yet even just this year 3 minors have been executed in Iran. There's great concern on a whole range of human rights issues in Iran. I do appreciate the government has a limited influence to bring to bear on this issue, but at the same time, surely, because these are such important humanitarian issues, we must keep pursuing all avenues to try to improve the human rights situation there.